Hey friends, welcome to another episode of True Consequences podcast. I'm your host, Eric Carter-Landin, and I am so grateful to be here today with you to discuss part 2 of the Ni Una Más series, Las Desaparecidas, the Women of Juarez. Before we get into the episode, I have some thanks I need to give. First, I want to thank Jackie Moranty for writing and researching this script. I want to thank Brandy D, Laura A, Dr. S for being my latest patron subscribers. I also need to thank Ellis V, Lisa W, Karina K, and Zoe S for being coffee supporters. If you want to support this show, go to patreon.com/trueconsequences or go to ko-fi.com/trueconsequences. I also need to tell you all about an exciting event that's happening the weekend of August 26th in Dallas. It's called the True Crime Podcast Festival. I am putting the link in the show notes below because I would love to meet all of my listeners that are able to make it to Dallas in August. It's a great opportunity to meet some of your favorite true crime creators, interact with some of the leading experts in the field of true crime, as well as just have a good time learning all about some of your favorite cases. The convention itself is organized and created by indie podcasters, so you're going to get a lot of great content. We've already got a lot of things on the docket that you're going to love. So go to tcpf.com, go to True Crime Podcast Festival's website, and sign up and come and meet me and hang out. Okay, that's all for the announcements. Let's get into the episode. My name is Eric Carter-Landin, and this is True Consequences. Ponce theorized that women were killed within 1 or 2 days of being abducted. Others theorized that women were kept alive for up to a week before being murdered. Ponce was caught flat-footed when a Univision crew took a video of one of the crime scenes showing law enforcement walking through and destroying evidence. They also appeared to be planting evidence in the form of a bloody blanket. She assured the media that she was making improvements to law enforcement through training and several new security measures. She said that she was posting police guards at the maquiladoras during shift changes and recruiting taxi drivers to take female workers home. She also warned that the women of Juarez should not walk alone. They should never hitchhike and always be aware of their surroundings. She told them that if they couldn't make a bus, they should call a relative for a ride, call a taxi, or even call the police, and she would send a patrol car to get them. Unfortunately, most of the women couldn't afford to take a taxi. Some didn't even have bus fare. None could afford cell phones. So many of the suggestions that Ponce gave really could not be implemented in reality. Also, the women didn't trust the taxi drivers or the police. And who could blame them? For years, the speculation was that the police were involved in the murders. One woman claimed that she was raped by police while in custody in 1999. Maria Talamantes was involved in a dispute with a neighbor, and she and her husband were arrested and taken to a Juarez jail. While waiting to see the judge, Maria was escorted into a bathroom where a female guard told her to remove her clothes so she could check her for drugs. The guard then fondled Maria. Maria pushed the woman away, and the woman told her to put her clothes back on. The following day, while still in custody, she was taken to a small room where guards told her they were going to rape her. They showed her pictures of the victims of Juarez murders, and they told her that she would be next. The following morning, a police officer entered her cell and raped her. Then, 2 more officers followed after him. Maria's story was substantiated by medical examinations after her release that day. The officers were arrested for Maria's rape, but the case was dismissed for lack of evidence. The story fueled the distrust among the people of Juarez for the police. On March 8, 1999, 4 profilers from the FBI visited Juarez, News reports said that the Mexican president, Ernesto Zedillo, had initiated the meeting after speaking with U.S. President Bill Clinton on the matter. The residents of Juarez were hopeful that the FBI could prove that the police had mishandled the investigation. By March, 3 more bodies had been found in remote areas outside the city. This was the first time that investigators were asked to come to Mexico. The visit was kept very quiet. The investigation was held under anonymity so that the police could be investigated as well as the crime. The FBI concluded that the crimes were not linked to one another. They didn't believe that a serial killer was on the loose in Juarez. The agents concluded that out of the 78 cases they reviewed, there was more than one killer roaming Juarez. In fact, the team suggested that the only real serial murders that had occurred could be put clearly on Sharif. The Rebeldes gang had been in jail for 3 years when the profilers arrived for their investigation. Each of the men were facing 17 counts of murder. On March 18, 1999, about 2 weeks after the FBI agents left town, another girl was found in the desert. She was a 14-year-old factory worker who had been abducted, brutally raped, strangled, and left for dead. On March 18, 1999, about 2 weeks after the FBI agents left town, another girl was found in the desert. She was a 14-year-old factory worker who had been abducted, brutally raped, strangled, and left for dead. She is a survivor, so her name is being withheld. By then, an estimated 172 women and girls had been murdered in Juarez. Miraculously, the young girl survived her attack and was able to give details to the police. The girl was on her way home from work at the maquiladora. She had caught her normal bus home, but hers was the last stop on the line. As she watched the last passenger leave the bus stop to walk home, she realized that the bus had turned around and was heading in the opposite direction from her home. The bus driver told her that he was having difficulties and just needed to stop at a gas station to get the bus fixed. Then he asked her if she ever had sex before. He then grabbed her by the throat. That was the last thing she remembered from the encounter. The next thing she knew, she woke up in the desert and was bleeding all over. She had no idea where she was. She crawled along the brush in the direction of a small house where the porch light was on. There she found help from 2 men who answered her knock at their door. She identified her attacker as the bus driver. His name was Jesus Manuel Guardado. He had charges filed against him by his pregnant wife, who accused him of beating her on several occasions. She told police that he had bragged that he had killed several women and left them in the desert. He also told her that he kept trophies from each of them. She recounted that he had shown up at home with a bloodied kitchen knife several times. But she didn't want to ask questions because she feared for her own life. Police arrested Guardado on March 29, 1999, and he divulged the names of 4 other men. 3 of them were bus drivers who had also played a part in the murders. These 4 were also arrested and charged with the murders that had occurred between June of 1998 and March of 1999. Ponce jumped at the new avenue to blame Sharif for executing murder while he was behind bars. Victor Moreno Rivera was a convicted drug dealer in Juarez. Moreno allegedly made contact with Sharif, who paid him $1,200 a month if he would agree to kill at least 4 women a month. Moreno negotiated with Sharif for 2 murders a month for $1,200 a month. Next, he enlisted 3 shuttle bus drivers, Agustin Toribio Castillo, Jose Gaspar Ceballos Chavez, and Bernardo Fernandez, to carry out these murders. Sharif supposedly gave the money to Moreno, who then split it between the bus drivers. The story was eerily familiar. It was actually the same story that had been concocted about Los Rebeldes back in 1996. It would later be reported that the director of the prison where the men were held was asked to lie about the contact between Moreno and Sharif. When he refused, he was forced to resign. The bus drivers claimed that they had been tortured into confessions. They were in their 19th day of incarceration when at least 20 more bodies were found in the desert. Volunteer searches were still taking place in the desert surrounding the city. Several women's advocate groups would arrange for searches to be held once a month in different locations. The searchers were mostly women, and they would start before sunrise so that they could search for a few hours before it became too hot. One of the women's groups was Voices Without Echo. At one of the searches, law enforcement showed up. Guillermina was excited to see that the officials were taking the murder seriously enough to participate in the search, until she realized that the officers who had shown up were drunk. They laughed and jeered at the search party, telling them that they were worthless and that the dead women didn't matter, that they deserved to die. Guillermina called the emergency number on her cell phone to report a drunk driver, but nothing ever came of it. Dr. Eduardo Muriel, a criminologist from Mexico City, was invited to come to Juarez during the winter of 1999 to help with the investigation of the murders. He had been invited by Attorney General Arturo González Rascón. Dr. Muriel was met with resistance from the start of his visit. He was continually denied access to the files that he needed to conduct an investigation, and Special Prosecutor Sully Ponce wouldn't help him gain access. 1 week after he arrived, he handed in his resignation. He cited inappropriate behavior on the part of the district attorney's office and his contempt for local authorities who had allegedly placed hidden cameras in the offices where he was supposed to work. He and his colleagues had been refused access to not only the files, but also the forensics laboratory. The DA's office refused to give them any leads or point them to any witnesses. They would not give any information. He was denied access to all crime scenes, with one exception. Ponce had been summoned to a crime scene but didn't have a ride, so he offered to drive her. By the time they got there, the scene had been cordoned off, but members of the DA's office were coming and going, contaminating the scene. Muriel tried to begin his own investigation. He noted that this woman had been murdered in a different way than the others had. The team learned that the victim had arrived at her factory job at the same time the suspect had. The day that woman disappeared, the man and woman left the factory at the same time. The man, or the suspect, later phoned his sister-in-law to tell her that he had been fired from his job, which gave him an excuse to be home early. But he hadn't been fired. He had arranged to leave work at the same time as the victim. She would later be found dead. Dr. Muriel would later tell reporters that he believed there was some kind of cover-up going on in Juarez. He suspected that managers of the maquillas were involved in the murders. He felt that the officials from the DA's office wanted his team to abandon the investigation. He also said that Sharif and Armendariz were only scapegoats, the easiest people to blame for the murders. Muriel had tried to interview the men, but he was denied access to the prison where they were being held. The police refused to give him any access, and the DA's office followed suit. Vicente Fox Quesada of the PAN Party was elected as president of Mexico in 2000. He promised an end to corruption. He wanted to grant state and local governments more power, and he wanted to restructure Mexico's federal law enforcement system. The women's groups of Juarez were rallying to gain attention from Fox. They were hoping that the transfer of power would bring about change. The situation in Juarez had become so dire that U.S. officials were calling for a review of the homicide investigations. Texas State Representative Norma Chavez from El Paso and Senators Elliot Shapley of Texas and Mary Jane Garcia of New Mexico were among the U.S. officials now rallying for a binational investigation into the murders. After all, not all of the women who were murdered in Juarez were from Mexico. Several were from Albuquerque, El Paso, and Phoenix. The murders of American women were of grave concern to the U.S. government. 2 months into Fox's term, on February 14, 2001, a 17-year-old young mother from Juarez named Lilia Alejandra Garcia Andrade disappeared without a trace. She was last seen leaving her factory job and heading towards a bus stop. Lilia's mother, Norma, immediately began to post flyers around the city in order to find her. She received threatening anonymous phone calls, but no information on her daughter's whereabouts. Lilia should have been safe. Sharif and the members of Los Rebeldes, as well as the bus drivers and their alleged leader Moreno, were all in prison. but women continued to be murdered in Juarez. Lilia was last seen crossing an abandoned lot adjacent to the factory where she worked. This lot was a shortcut to the bus stop where she would meet her bus to get home. A week later, Lilia's body was found in the vacant lot she used as a shortcut to get to the bus. She had been dead for about a day and a half, so she had spent at least 5 days in captivity before she was murdered and left in that vacant lot. Hers was the first body to be found within Juarez city limits. Up until this point, all of the victims had been recovered from outlying desert areas. Oscar Maines saw this change as significant. He felt that leaving the bodies in a more well-traveled part of the city showed that the murderers felt they were above detection, and they certainly believed they were above the law. Lilia had been beaten, raped, strangled, and set on fire. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxia by strangulation. The MO was identical to earlier killings. The Attorney General's office blamed copycats. After all, the real criminals were already in jail. By this time, Sule Ponce was under the gun to get things figured out. She claimed that there had only been one murder since she took office, but the residents of the city knew better. Another body had been found just a week before. The maquilladora that Lilia worked at offered a reward of 15,000 pesos for information leading to the arrest of the killer or killers. This resulted in a flood of false leads to the DA's office from people who just wanted the money. The situation blew up when the public learned that municipal police had failed to respond to an emergency call about a rape in progress in the area where Lilia's body was found. According to the police log, the call had come in on February 19th at 10:15 p.m. This was 5 days after Lilia had gone missing. The caller reported 2 men in the car were raping a woman who was naked and crying for help. The police failed to dispatch a patrol car to the area. A second call came in that night with the same report, but the police didn't get to the area until 11:25 p.m. The officers called back in at 11:05 with nothing to report. Hey friends, I want to take a moment and introduce you to one of my favorite new products that I have found. It's called Magic Mind. And if you're like me, you have low energy, but you get stressed out and have anxiety, I think this might be the perfect solution for you. Magic Mind has changed my life. Look, I'm a 2 cup of coffee a day kind of person, or at least I was until Magic Mind. One of the things that I struggle with is trying to balance my anxiety and my desire to procrastinate. And what I found by drinking Magic Mind is that it gives me the energy and focus that I need to get things done, while also keeping me from being jittery or stressed out. So let me tell you a little bit more about Magic Mind. It's one little shot that has improved my day so much, and I love that I can take it with me everywhere I go and drink it whenever I need an energy boost. Here's the thing. Not only has it allowed me to reduce my coffee intake, but it's also made me more productive, more focused, and I get more done in less time due to the nootropics that are inside, which improve attention, focus, and cognition. The other thing that I love about it is I don't get as stressed out. The L-theanine inside of Magic Mind helps my body produce less cortisol, which means I'm not as stressed out. The ingredients are all really good for you. The L-theanine, like I said, really helps you by lowering your cortisol levels. Ashwagandha and rhodiola rosea are 2 of my favorite ingredients because they decrease stress as well as low-grade anxiety. In a number of studies, rhodiola rosea helped improve mental clarity, while on the long run, reduced stress. So I totally stand behind Magic Mind because it works for me. It gives me the energy I need without stressing me out. If you're like me and you need energy to get through your day, but you don't want to be stressed out from coffee, I highly recommend you check out Magic Mind at magicmind.co/consequence. The next 10 days, you can get 40% off of your subscription at magicmind.co/consequence using my discount code consequence20. And if you don't want to subscribe and you just want to try it out, you can save 20% off your first one-time purchase. All you have to do is go to magicmind.co/consequence, use my code consequence20. I promise you, you're going to love it. By this time, Amnesty International had gotten involved and they were demanding answers. They were the first to give the murders a name. They called them femicides. They had found that Mexican officials had neglected to review the mistakes they had made in Lilia's case, and they were denying that the emergency call had anything to do with her. On International Women's Day, March 8, 2001, the women of Juarez had finally had enough. They stormed the prosecutor's office and demanded her resignation. They protested their anger that officials weren't doing enough to stop the violence against women in Juarez. The number of homicides at that point was more than 300. Hundreds of protesters took to the streets from Juarez and El Paso with wooden crosses and photos of their lost daughters, sisters, and cousins. They carried banners that read, "Not another one," "Enough," and "No more corruption," "No more ineptness." Many of the women chanted, "Out with Zuli." There were 2 crosses planted that day, one in front of the prosecutor's office and the other where Lilia Garcia was found. The protesters marched into Ponce's office and demanded that she resign on the spot. It isn't clear what made government officials remove Zule Ponce from office, but she was removed in April of 2001. She wasn't fired, though. She was promoted. She took the role of regional coordinator of the North Zone. In this role, she was still overseeing the murders of the women in Juarez. A new special prosecutor was appointed, Zulema Bolivar. She was a former sex crimes investigator for the Chihuahua State Attorney General's office. In November of 2001, 8 bodies were found in a cotton field inside the city. Some of the victims had been buried. Others just left out in the open for scavengers. The bodies had been there anywhere from 6 months to a few weeks. Less than 3 weeks later, police announced that they had arrested 2 more bus drivers for these murders. Authorities said that Javier Victor Garcia Uribe and Gustavo Gonzalez Mesa had confessed to kidnapping, raping, and murdering the 8 victims in the cotton field. Garcia had been among the first group of bus drivers to be rounded up and questioned in the fall of '99, but he was released due to a lack of evidence. Gonzalez had never been implicated in any of the murders, and there was an attempt to link these men to the crimes. The Attorney General's office said that they had connections to the first set of bus drivers. News reports stated that a woman had come forward and told police that she saw one of the men dumping a body into the field that night. She told authorities that he was driving a blue sedan. Garcia drove a blue van. Garcia was arrested and his wife retained a lawyer named Sergio Dante Almaraz. Almaraz had been called by Garcia's wife before when he was brought in for questioning the first time. Elections were again around the corner and the district attorney was desperate for a break in the case. When Miriam, Victor's wife, finally found out where he was being held, he was ill. When Miriam was finally able to see Victor after learning where he was being held, he was very ill. He had been beaten and burned until he confessed to the murders. Both bus drivers had. They couldn't take the torture, so they confessed. This time the citizens of Juarez were skeptical, and they asked questions about the guilt of the bus drivers. They didn't believe that the men were guilty. Even the victims' families were questioning the guilt of the bus drivers. This was the first time that victims' families and those accused were on the same side. When police were asked how they knew the 2 were guilty, they said they had been surveilling Garcia since the first time he was arrested in 1999. They alluded to have seen him taking one of the young women and leaving her body in the cotton field. The idea was crazy, but it's what police went with. They even offered to show video of the interrogations of the 2 men, but when reporters asked to see the video, they couldn't find it. When the video was finally released, it showed both men giving full statements along with names, dates, clothing that the women wore, and where they had been picked up and where they were left. Many asked how the men who were supposedly high on drugs could have such an amazing recall of these events. The police responded that many drugs can be used in order to heighten awareness and become more alert. The director of the prison resigned just after the men were arrested. He had reportedly signed off on a medical report that documented the men's injuries when they came into prison. When asked about the injuries on the men's bodies, the Attorney General González Rascón claimed that the men had inflicted the injuries on themselves after they were put in prison. When asked how prisoners were able to get matches or a lighter, much less a cattle prod while inside prison, he had no answer. Sergio Almaraz had offered to represent both of the bus drivers pro bono. The wives took him up on that since they both believed their husbands to be innocent. Shortly after the arrest, the families of the men and Almaraz began getting death threats. While Sule Ponce was no longer the special prosecutor in charge of the investigation of these homicides, she had her fingers in the pie. She was a bit dismayed when members of her own staff began to tell her that the bus drivers weren't responsible for the murders of the 8 women. They told her to either let the men go and admit they weren't perpetrators, or she could get to work to prove they were. The case against them was very weak and she needed to get it together. The case against them was weak, and all of the pressure was on Sule to get it together. Ponce opted to continue to accuse the bus drivers without any evidence. She found a 37-year-old woman who claimed to have been raped by Garcia in July of 1996. The woman didn't fit the description of any of the murdered women, but there she was, telling her story in front of the state police and the media. The woman's story led to further charges being filed against Garcia, but they were dropped when the woman refused to testify at trial. Oscar Maines had avoided doing anything that would be considered unethical for the many years that he worked on this case. While the bus drivers were being held for the 8 murders of the cotton field, he claimed that he was ordered to plant evidence against them. He refused. He continued to work the case ethically and honestly. He made sure that the work he was doing was not tampered with. He insisted on staying with the case until the bus drivers went to court. Then, in January of 2002, he passed his findings on to the judge who was overseeing the trial. Maines was certain that he could solve the Cottonfield murders if given enough time. An initial investigation showed that at least 3 of the girls had been killed and mutilated the same way that Lilia Garcia had. Lilia had been found about 100 yards from where the others were found. Maines was convinced that these cases were linked. On January 2, 2002, Maines was forced to resign his position as head of the Department of Forensics and Legal Medicine. He would later say that he was disappointed and ashamed that the investigation had been done so poorly. Maines had also turned all his documentation over to a friend in Juarez in case something happened to the original. The DNA profile of Lilia Garcia's killer was in that file. He maintained that police or drug traffickers were to blame for the deaths in Juarez. He said that this had to be a group that was highly organized and had resources to do things that they had done to these women. Maines was not the only one who insisted that the bus drivers were innocent. The media also raised questions about how they could be involved in such an elaborate scheme. They worked long hours, they had wives and children at home, and none of this made any sense. In 2001, President Vicente Fox announced that he was going to involve federal authorities in the investigation of the Women of Juarez. He referred to the murders as a national shame. In December of 2001, Fox demanded that 76 files be transferred to the Federal Attorney General's office for review. He was essentially cutting out the local and state governments. The files were supposed to be turned over by January 7, 2012. Only 10 of the 76 files were turned over to federal authorities. The claims by Ponce that they had locked up everyone who could be associated with the murders were refuted again and again as more bodies were found in Juarez. Ponce and Arturo Rascon both turned in their resignations shortly after the files had been turned over to the federal government. But they were both offered promotions instead. The bus drivers were still being held, but they had moved from the prison in Juarez to Chihuahua, about 200 miles away from their families and their homes. Sergio Dante Amaraz, Victor Garcia's lawyer, was furious that the men had been moved. He told reporters in an interview in the spring of 2002 that this move would make it almost impossible to mount a defense for the 2 bus drivers. He referred to the Constitution, which states that a trial must be held where the crime was committed, because that is where the witnesses are, and that is where the evidence is found. Mario Escobedo Jr. was a lawyer for the second bus driver, Gustavo Gonzalez Mesa. Both lawyers had received several death threats since offering to defend the bus drivers, but they forged ahead and tried to prove what everyone knew. The drivers were innocent. Both lawyers presented over 40 pieces of evidence, including pictures of the torture that the bus drivers had endured. They also presented evidence that the men had been in other locations at the time the murders had occurred. They felt that they had built a successful case for their clients, but the judge refused to take any more evidence after the first round was entered. In February of 2002, Escovedo made a public announcement that he intended to file a criminal complaint against the state police officials for kidnapping and torturing his client. On February 5th, Escovedo spoke with Amaras and told him that he had been receiving death threats. Escovedo did not recognize the voice, but he thought it was someone from the state police. Officials had been badgering him to abandon the criminal complaint, but Escovedo refused and insisted that he would go forward with it. That evening, Escovedo was on his way home from his office when he noticed that he was being followed by an SUV. He called his father for help. Quote, "Dad, I'm being tailed," he told his father, Mario Cesar Escovedo Sr. His father was also a lawyer. Mario Sr. had been assisting his son with the case, but they had both considered abandoning the case in light of the escalating death threats against them. The elder Escovedo said, "Not to worry." "No, Papa, don't hang up. I'm being followed. Papa, they're following me." The father stayed on the line with his son as he ran to his truck. "I'm coming. I'll be right there with you. Describe the vehicles." "It's a Grand Cherokee, Papa, covered in mud. Hurry." "I'm on my way, son. Stay calm. Keep your wits about you." "Papa, hurry. They're pulling out their weapons." It was then that Mario Escovedo Sr. heard gunshots. He heard tires screeching, and then he heard a crash. "Son, answer me." There was no response. The next morning, the police made an announcement that it was them who had shot Mario Escovedo Jr. They said it was a case of mistaken identity. They thought they were chasing a drug dealer. One official told the media that the younger Escovedo had refused to pull over and had returned fire to the police. Crime scene photos showed that there were at least 10 bullet holes in the truck driven by Escovedo. It was later reported that police who shot him were under orders from the commander who had supervised the detention of the bus drivers. The vehicle was owned by one of the department's commanders, Roberto Alejandro Castro Valles. He was later cleared of any wrongdoing and was given a promotion as a security officer in the Federal Anti-Corruption Ministry in Mexico City. The state had reported that Escovedo had died as a result of traumatic brain injury, suffered in a motor vehicle accident. But news reporters had been at the scene of the crime and had reported that he died from a gunshot wound to the head. At his funeral, several activists showed up with placards that said, "No hay justicia en Ciudad Juarez," which means there is no justice in Juarez. And there wasn't any justice. The police who had killed Mario Escovedo were set free. A judge would rule that they had shot the young lawyer in self-defense. Despite this, Amaras chose to continue to defend Garcia. In February of 2003, one of the accused bus drivers, Gustavo Gonzalez Mesa, was found dead in his cell. The official ruling was that he had died of a heart attack caused by a blood clot. But the residents of Juarez believed his death to be suspicious. Garcia was sentenced to 50 years in prison for the murders of the 8 women in the cotton field in 2004, despite all evidence of his innocence. His sentence was overturned the following year and he was set free. Throughout 2001 and even till now, many more bodies have been found. Some in the city of Juarez, some in the desert outside the city. Governments have changed power many times, but the response is still that of indifference to these missing and murdered women. The police continue to accuse victims and say that they deserve to die. Officials still contend that they are doing the best they can, and men are still being falsely accused in connection with these murders. The maquiladoras still crank out parts for cars, electronics, motorboats at a rate of $5 a day. The activists and the victims' families still hold protests and rallies. Meanwhile, according to Amnesty International, the body count as of December 2021 is over 2,000. But no one really knows how many women have been murdered in Juarez. In 1993, a very evident pattern was beginning to emerge, not just around the killing, but through the meandering, crooked trail of failed investigations, firings, lack of physical evidence, false accusations, forced confessions, evasions, and obfuscations. The problem is that when you have a disease, you have to diagnose it correctly before you can give it adequate treatment. You need the right medicine. Oscar Maines is quoted as saying this: "A lot of these murders are linked, but which ones? I don't know because there has never been a serious investigation." End quote. The voices of the missing and murdered women of Juarez cry from the desert. How many more will it take for them to be heard? Thanks for watching. Stay safe, New Mexico.